Web development, I assume you guys know what the web is, right? It's the internet. It's, what we're all using all the time. It's changed a lot, in the last 30 years since we started using it in a mainstream context. I've been making websites since I was like a kid. So when Flash came out, do you guys know what Flash is? Some people know what Flash is. When Flash came out in like 1996, I was like very, very excited to use it to create animation on the web. We have like way more sophisticated ways of doing stuff these days, but the basic technology is still the same. So we're going to talk a little bit about the basic technology. So when we talk about the internet, it's used colloquially to mean a lot of different things these days, but it basically just means a network of networks. So when the technology of the internet was first being created, it was created mostly in like academic labs, like at UCLA, at Stanford, at MIT, places like that. And they were developing this technology to be able to communicate between computers. And the original technology was based on, we had phone lines before that were actually connected via wires. You would pick up the phone, call somebody, you would hear their voice, they could hear your voice. The idea for this is for a computer to be able to do that communication without actually a human being involved. So instead of sending your voice, like an analog stream of your voice across the phone line, it would just send a stream of zeros and ones, just data, straight up data that would be interpreted by the computer on the other side. So a lot of the internet is just different protocols and different methods of interpreting that data and then sending responses back. So yeah, as I mentioned, one of the main sort of like motivations behind creating the internet was to create decentralized data. And this was for like during the Cold War, the army wanted to basically be able to have all their data backed up in different places. So if like some city like DC or something got nuked, they would have like a backup of that data. So a lot of the internet, the structure of it, the sort of design of it is based on this kind of like Cold War paranoia. That's kind of interesting, but it's also, arguably it would have been eventually designed in that way, even if there wasn't a Cold War, because decentralized data has a lot of advantages over centralized data. So these days, all of this stuff is built on servers. When the internet was kind of like early on, people used to have like servers in their house where they would actually share data across the internet. That's not so common these days because of the amount of data that's stored on servers. They have like huge warehouses that have all the data on them, and most people interact through different platforms like Google or Amazon or Facebook, other platforms that save all of your data and then send it to other people. But when the internet first started to exist, people actually would have a server like in their basement, and they would serve up their own websites, serve up their own chat channels, things like that. So some terminology, a client is any device that's getting data from the internet. So that could be your computer, could be your phone, could be your TV, could be your like refrigerator these days. Like anything that is receiving data and presenting data from the internet is referred to as a client. And browsers are one way that we interact with the internet. It's kind of, I guess it's the main way. I mean, a lot of people don't really use browsers as much anymore because they're doing stuff directly through native apps. But browsers are still the basic way that we access the internet. And when we're creating a website, we're creating something that typically is going to be accessed through a browser. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of different protocols that the internet uses to communicate. So the data is all just a bunch of numbers. And so we have to come up with ways for one computer to understand what the sequence of numbers means versus any other sequence of numbers. So there's a lot of different types of protocols. The one that we'll probably use the most is HTTP. This is the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And if you look at any URL, pretty much any URL on a website that you're on, it's going to start with HTTP. So that's basically telling the computer this resource is written in hypertext. And hypertext is the basic kind of language that we use to create a website. And the main thing that hypertext has that's different than other languages is the ability to link to other pages. So everything on the internet can be linked somewhere else. FTP, we probably actually won't use. We used to use it in this class. I haven't actually taught this class in a long time, but we used to use FTP and everybody hated it, but we have better ways of doing it now. So we probably don't have to worry about that. But FTP is just file transfer protocol. It's how you create your files for your website and then you transfer it to a server so that other people can access it. An IP address is the sort of numbers that most websites and other addresses on the internet use to differentiate from one another. So when you go to like google.com or whatever, that's just a nickname. It's actually pointing to some string of numbers that kind of looks like that. But we use domain names because obviously they're easier for us to remember than a bunch of numbers, at least most of us. Or, that's how we have gotten used to doing it. And all of our computers actually have their own IP address. So when you access a website, they're going to look at your IP address and they'll be able to figure out certain things like what country are you in, and where in the country are you, and what kind of computer are you using, other stuff like that. So domain name is what I just mentioned. This is the name that we map an IP address to make it easier to remember and to type in. As I said, google.com, any other website is going to have a domain. There's a few different types of domains. It doesn't really matter as much anymore. When the domains first came out, .com was for commercial companies, .gov was only for government entities, .org was only for nonprofit organizations. But those rules don't really apply so much anymore, and there's a lot more what's called the top-level domain, or TLD, which is like, you can get .pizza or .cool is what I have for my website. So there's a lot more of these now. Obviously, there's like a certain value in these domain names because they're a scarce resource now. But that's basically all they're doing is pointing to some numbers that the computer will recognize. When we type in an address into our browser, which is just one way of accessing the internet, there's a lot of other ways that we could do it, but it's the one that we use the most. When we're typing an address into the computer, it's sending a request to a server somewhere, and that server is saying, okay, they're looking for this, and it gets all the data together, and then it sends it back to us. And it uses actually really cool technology. This stuff is kind of whatever, but the reason the internet works really well is because the protocol, basically what they figured out how to do is instead of taking the one big piece of data and sending it as one long stream, they figured out a way to break it up into lots of little parts and send it through the network, and they all find the fastest way that they can to get to the computer, which is why the internet is actually really fast. If you've ever transferred a file from your phone to the computer or from something onto the computer and you watch the bar go across as it's transferring, that's because it's transferring the file from the first bit to the last bit, and that takes a lot of time. One of the reasons the internet is really cool is because they figured out a way to do that much, much faster than a basic file transfer. All right, so that's a little bit about the technology. We're going to talk a little bit about how websites are actually designed kind of in a modern context. So most websites are made by a design company or some kind of creative tech company or whatever. Usually it starts with sort of a proposal, which is called the creative brief. And then there's a design built from that proposal, which is the UX design or UI design. And then we do the front-end development and the back-end development. So front-end development is what the client sees. So it's all the stuff that renders the information on your browser or on your phone or whatever. Back-end development handles the requests and figures out what we need to send to the user. So both of those are really important. Most developers these days kind of do a combination of the two, but they used to be much more sort of, there's only front end over here and there's only back end over here. So this is what a creative brief might look like. You would outline, so this is kind of like pitching, like one company usually will be pitching to another company, like this is your company, this is what you're trying to sell, this is like your goal or whatever. and this is how we're going to realize those goals. So the goals of the website, the target user, who the website is for, is an important thing to think about. The timeline for how long it's going to take to build the website, depending on how complex the website is, it could take a long time. The budget for building a website, the staff that are needed, how many developers, designers, etc. The specifications for the website, and then how the website will be maintained over time. That last one is actually really important. It's something that a lot of agencies and developers don't really allocate enough resources to. Once you build the website, you're kind of like, oh great, I made this website, like see you later. But in my experience as a freelance developer, maintaining the website is actually going to end up taking a lot more of your time than building the website in the first place. UX design is kind of like, we didn't really talk about this for the first 10 or 20 years of the internet, but now that we have platforms and much more information-rich experiences, UX is a lot more important. UX is basically the experience that a user has going through the website. So we're thinking about, do they know where to click? Do they know what the most important information is? What information do they want to see first? Do they know how to change their profile name? Change their image? All of these different things go into the user experience design, thinking about what the user is seeing and how to get them through the process of doing what they want to do. So basic sitemap is a good way to sort of diagram the information that's available on the website. This is like a sitemap for an artist, I guess. And so you might have your homepage, you might have some different types of work that you do, and then you might have some contact and some, a blog post or something like that. So this is part of the design process, just thinking about what's all the information on the page and what's sort of the hierarchy of that information. Wireframes are where we're getting a little bit closer to how the website is actually going to look. So we can roughly sketch out how the content will look on the page. Usually we want to think about what's the most important content, how can we highlight that, what are the kind of conventions, where do people expect to see things like menus or links to different social media or the main part of the article. So working with the conventions that exist on the internet and basic design, but also thinking about the best way to present the information. Responsive design is also something that is much more important in the last 15 years than it was at the beginning of the internet, because we have phones and tablets and different size computers and different displays with different pixel densities and all this different stuff. So these days when we build a website, we have to make it so that it fits on every single platform. And so here are the basic languages that we're going to be using to create our first website. So HTML is where we're going to start. And HTML is the content and the structure of the website. So all the text, the images, if you have videos, things like that, all go into the HTML. So once we build the HTML, then we add on top of that CSS. CSS, it doesn't say on there. HTML is hypertext markup language. CSS is cascading style sheets. CSS is the color, font, layout, anything that is the design aspect of what we see on a website is written in CSS. And then JavaScript is used for anything that changes, like any animation, any interaction. If you have a game on a website, all that stuff is done these days using JavaScript. So we're going to look at all three of those languages during this the next few weeks. We're going to start with HTML today. This is kind of what HTML looks like. It's kind of boring, but it's actually a good language. It's been used as the main language for making websites for over 30 years, and lots of people have tried to say HTML sucks, we need something better, but it still is around. I think it's fine. It's a little annoying and it's kind of tedious to write, but there's a lot of little shortcuts and methods that you can use to make it easier. So I'll go over a few of those today, actually. But that's what a basic HTML page looks like. I'm going to go over the syntax in more depth when we get into our demo, so I won't spend a lot of time here. Yeah, I'm going to go over this later. We've already talked about Creative Commons stuff a lot, but we'll continue to do this in when we're creating our website. So if you use images for your choose your own adventure story that are Creative Commons, you can include like a link to the original source. That's an easy thing to do with HTML. We've already kind of done that using WordPress, which is obviously a platform that generates HTML content. But yeah, we will continue to talk about using Creative Commons. So then CSS, we can see a page without CSS and then a page with CSS. So the page without CSS is really boring. It's just black and white. There's only content. Page with CSS gets a little bit more interesting. We have colors and styles and stuff like that. And so that's what CSS looks like. We'll get into the specifics of all this stuff in the demo. And then JavaScript is what we're going to use later on in a few weeks. This is used to create interactions, to create more interesting animations and stuff that's happening over time in the web browser. I spend like 90% of my life writing JavaScript, so that's kind of the language that I know really well as a web developer, and I like it a lot, but it's a kind of a weird language, and we'll get into that in a few weeks. Backend development, we're not going to get into this in this class, although people have this attitude that backend developers are like the most hardcore developers or whatever, and that some backend stuff is pretty hard to write, but it's actually not really that different. It uses the same concepts. There are some different languages that you use, but it's really the same stuff. It's just working on the server side instead of the client side. But we won't really get into it this semester. So yeah, we're going to use a code editor. We'll use this one. I'll go over it in a second. I guess that's it. So yeah, let's actually write some HTML. We can get started. As I mentioned before, it's a little bit different than how we've been working so far this semester. We're not going to be dragging and clicking and doing things visually. We're actually going to be writing our code through the text editor and then seeing what the result is. So the development process is a little bit different. So let's get started. I'm going to stop